Check 1, 2.
Oh, did you get another hot mic?
I did. So here, you can have yours.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
You're so kind to me all the time.
I try.
Test, test. Good morning. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started today. My name is Matt Tanney. I'm Director of Athletics and Campus Wellness at Wabash College, and I'm pleased to be moderating this morning the session Best Practices for Hiring and Retaining Administrators and Coaches of Color. And just as a couple of housekeeping things here before we get started and I introduce our two panelists, just as a courtesy to our presenters, if you could please silence your devices. And please also note that this session is being recorded and it'll be posted publicly on ncaa.org and the NCAA's YouTube channel following the convention. So I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists this morning, and I'm looking forward to a good conversation. First, to my far left, to your right, is John Hind. John is the Director of Athletics at Hamilton College, where he served there since 2007. And prior to Hamilton, he coached lacrosse and held a number of administrative positions at Butler over a 16-year career at Butler. To my immediate left is Dr. Miriam Merrill. She is the Director of Athletics and Chair of Physical Education at Pomona-Pitzer, where she has served since 2020. She previously served at Hamilton College as the Associate Director of Athletics and the Senior Woman Administrator, working with John, which I think will hopefully create some great dialogue this morning. And previous to that, she served as Director of Athletics at the Richard J. Daley College in Chicago. So with that being said, I thought we could jump into the conversation here, and I think I'll start with John. John, you have a really strong record of hiring and identifying administrators and coaches of color throughout your career. Can you just start maybe with some framework on how you've done that at Hamilton and elsewhere?
Sure. Thank you, Matt. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm actually humbled to be up here on the stage because I don't look at things that I have done to that degree of notoriety, but I'll jump in. I've been fortunate. I'm very fortunate that I've had opportunities where I've been in positions where I can determine who works with me and how they get to that position. My very first hire, actually, as head lacrosse coach at College of Worcester, was a member of the BIPOC community who had finished his playing career at Hobart. And to me, it was just a great hire of a great defensive-minded person to coach the defense on our team. It was only after hiring Tim that I realized, oh boy, how should I put it? The greater hurdles and perils that he faced as a BIPOC member that I can think about what it might be, but I don't know firsthand. But I witnessed things. I witnessed things on our campus. I witnessed things among our own team. I witnessed things in the greater community, and realized very quickly that I had brought Tim there, and that I had a responsibility to create as much pathway for success that I could possibly for Tim. And it extended far beyond just the coaching meetings, figuring out what defense were we going to play zone or man-to-man. It went way beyond that. And so I started working with Tim. I then had the fortune at Butler, both as head lacrosse coach and then as Matt said, I held several positions, including assistant athletic director, associate athletic director, interim athletic director, where I had opportunity to give people opportunity and to give people a first chance. We've all had a first chance. The first day we were an administrator was the first day we were an administrator. The first day I was an assistant coach was the first day I was an assistant coach, and so on and so forth. And a lot goes along with that, and I think we hold responsibility when we give people opportunity to guide them appropriately and do everything we can to foster their success. Their success leads to our success ultimately. I think I'll stop there because I get winded.
That's okay. So I'm going to toss it to Miriam here. So as someone that worked with John previously, can you talk about that experience and your hiring at Hamilton?
Sure. And I will say, I don't think I've ever heard you give that short of an answer, but yeah, so, one of the things that I think was really great about my experience, so for those of you who may not know, Hamilton is in central New York, right east of Syracuse, snow, cold, not a very diverse community. And so knowing that, one of the things I remember in my interview, my first conversation was with the diversity, equity, inclusion officer, right? So I was able to ask the questions that I needed to know, right? Where am I getting my hair done at? Is there a community of folks? How is dating, right? So all of those things that I needed to know, and I think he was very intentional about making sure that that person was the first person that I talked to on my interview. So that certainly was great. And then after that, I remember being connected to folks of color outside of my department, so that I could, start to gain a network, because, one of the things that's really most important is having a sense of community, because that will keep people around. So it's more than just they're hired, right? It's they're hired and how do they feel grounded, connected, and centered in the community.
Well, I think that provides a good start and a good framework for the conversation today. So the title of the session is Hiring and Retaining. And I think we're going to try to split that up a little bit and look at both of those areas in terms of how we can explore that. So let's start with the hiring process. And this is for either one of you. If you could just share a little bit more about your overarching philosophy as you evaluate candidate pools, whether that's on the administrative side or the coaching side.
You want me to jump in? Sure. I think the first step is the most critical step. It goes way beyond simply putting out an advertisement. And obviously, the ability to hire members of the BIPOC community at Butler, for example, was very different than hiring at Hamilton. It's one thing to be situated in the middle of Indianapolis versus in Clinton. And so I think it goes way beyond the advertisement. If you simply want to put out the ad and then wait to see what comes in and then react off of the people who have applied, you'll miss the boat. You'll continually miss the boat. And for some of you, maybe it's intentional that you miss the boat, but you need to be more aggressive in creating network. I mean, I don't know how far back to go, but you need to establish network where your name is in communities that you don't have access to sitting in, so that when the MOA convention is going on and I have networked with people who know who I am and my name can come up in my absence, that's helpful. It's helpful to reach out to people you know across all areas, quite honestly, to find out who is out there. I would also stop briefly to say, if all you are ever going to set your sights on is experience, you're going to miss the boat again. Because so many people in the BIPOC community don't have the experience because they haven't been given the opportunity. And so you have to create the opportunity. So you have to first establish what is your standard? What are your standards? If your standard is to find the most experienced person, then there's a strong possibility, although things are better today than they were, and they continue to improve. But if you continue to just look for experience, a lot of the folks out there like Miriam didn't have the experience. So I'm going to end, I'll stop here. I'll let questions certainly along the way. As a lacrosse coach and as an administrator, my guiding principle is recruit for character, teach the skill. If I'm a great teacher, I can teach the skill. I can't teach character in a month. So when I recruit, I'm not recruiting to find the person with the most experience, the person who can cross every T and dot every I on compliance or on scheduling. I find people of high character. I make mistakes. Human behavior is a tough science, but I look for people who are of high character, and then it's my responsibility to mentor and teach them to do their job.
Yeah, and if I could just kind of bring that to life. So my experience, I was an AD at a 2-year institution, right? So to make the jump from a 2-year institution not having any Division III experience to also being at, a NESCAC school, right? That jump for a lot of folks who may have been hiring at the time would not have made sense, right? So I think exactly to what John is speaking about allowed me an opportunity to really be at a great institution and to learn a lot from him. I'll also underscore his suggestion of a network, right? So making sure that your network does not look like just you, so that you can in turn make sure that you have a diverse pool. I'll also talk a little bit about the process, because I think that might be helpful. So one of the things when we have our big searches, we make sure that everybody on the search committee watches a video on implicit bias. And so that's just so that we're aware, right, of the things that may come up as we say, oh, this person could be a good fit or not. We also use a matrix system, so we use numbers instead of names. So we don't necessarily know gender. We'll use last names, but not first names. And then we will divide up, and this was actually given to me by Holly at CalU. It's basically, you take a look at your job description and the things that are important, you put in the matrix, and either people show evidence of it, high evidence, some evidence, or no evidence, right? So that way we don't get caught up in, ooh, this person went to this institution, right? Which is great, but we really want to make sure that it's the experience that we were looking at and not some of the things that don't necessarily matter or may exclude other folks. And then lastly, throughout our interview process, we use a matrix. So it's never a general, tell me what you think. It's based on these things that we're looking at, and that's everyone who is involved in the process fills out a matrix to talk about. Now, there's certainly times for folks to talk qualitatively about candidates that come in, but that's certainly not what initially drives the conversation.
So,
If I could just jump back into something Miriam pointed out, and that was, since I didn't touch much on process, but process well on campus is really important. If I have just speaking very bluntly, if I have a white candidate, I don't need to make sure that candidate meets all the white people in our community. We're quite settled with that side of things. But on the other hand, bringing in Miriam, it was critical because I can only speak to what I think that experience might be for her, but I think it's critical to get her in touch with other people in the BIPOC community so they can actually, as she alluded to, they can actually have that conversation in real time and in real life about what it might look like. I'll get into much more when we get into the actual mentoring part. But.
Okay, I'm gonna add one more thing too.
of course.
We speak each other's language here. And what I want to point out is that is work, right? For John to have to say, hey, faculty member, hey, student affairs member, hey, folks of color, I have somebody coming in. I really want to make sure that they have a chance to meet you, create community. That is work for him, but that is the work that you're going to have to engage in whenever we talk about hiring and retaining.
So follow-up question for John and Marion as well. Related, John, really off of your comment on sort of the art of hiring and your comment on human character, and it's tough to make those judgments sometimes in the hiring process, and including evaluating experience. So you mentioned character. What are other things that stand out to you during the hiring process, other than experience, to help you sift through many applications?
Sure. Well, sifting through the applications, I thought you were eventually going to ask about the process on campus, but I'll back up to the applications. When looking at the applications, again, I have done groundwork beforehand. So if I'm simply going to rely on just getting the folders, opening them up, looking at the material, and making split-second decisions on yes or no, I'm not sure I would end up with the folks I've ended up with. I do back work to figure out who's out there, who might have interest, who's trying to move up in athletic administration. Previous to that, who's trying to move up in coaching. And so I already have a good sense of who they are as a person. Then that leads to the on-campus interview. I mean, Miriam, I don't know that I would have asked you a single technical question about the job. I don't care. That's my responsibility to figure out how to teach them the technical side to things. What I want to do is watch that person interact with everyone on campus. Do they say hello with the same energy that they say hello to the custodian, the same way they say hello to the president? Or is there a difference? So that's what I mean when I talk about character. I want to see how they interact with everyone in our department. I want to talk about things that have nothing to do with sports. I want to talk about things that are broader and I would say more important in life. Not that what we do isn't important, but there's a whole lot more out there than the whistles and the balls. I'll stop.
Anything you want to follow up on that? You good? So let's talk a little bit still on the hiring process here on campus partnerships. And I think both of you have touched on this a little bit, but working with your human resources department, working with other campus colleagues to facilitate this process.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we make sure that we do is that we, certainly it's not just athletic department or Department of Physical Education employees on our searches, so making sure that folks outside of our department are there. Also our Chief Diversity Officer as well, making sure that they are cued in kind of early in on the process and then throughout if that's something that they choose to be. But it certainly is important on our end to make sure that we are connecting with others on our campus.
Yeah, I think all of us talk about it all the time, and that is being representative of the institution that we're representing. And so, I think it would be awkward, again, it's what are you doing along the way to establish the relationships, not just with the BIPOC members in your community, but with your whole entire community. If you are networked in with the whole community, it makes it much easier to make a phone call to just about anyone on campus to ask if they'll participate and give you feedback on interviewing someone. And so I think that the networking within your own campus community is absolutely critical all the time.
So I should have mentioned this at the outset. We're going to allow for questions here as we go. And so we have microphones positioned around the room in the center aisle here. And if anybody has a question, please don't hesitate to step up to a microphone, and we're happy to field those. So before,
Matt, could I just jump in?
Of course.
One thought that I had.
Here he goes.
That
This is the John I know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I just wanted to tie it back. A little bit ago, we were talking about networking, and we were talking about the importance of, networking. It goes in both directions. If you're a member of the BIPOC community, you need to network outside of your own community as well. It'll create better opportunities for you just to be networked across a diverse pool of people.
I think we have a question here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Fred Cohen, FAR from Wesleyan. And one of the things that I ask when I'm doing on the job search committee is I want to make sure that the candidate understands the Division III philosophy, and in particular that they get that our student athletes, we expect them to have a chance to be excellent in the academics as well as the athletics. And so the question is, I want to be able to ask these questions in a way that I'm not drilling down for alums from Smith, Amherst, Wesleyan, and so on, right? So suggestions on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think what I'll throw on quickly is to listen for. So I think what you want to make sure is, or what you know is what you want to listen for. And that is things about like understanding the student athlete experience, wanting to support students, and understanding the balance between academics and athletics. So, and I hope that's what I did during my interview. But as a Division I student athlete and then working in the two-year institution and also spending some time in NAIA, right? Just because I didn't come from a Division III philosophy didn't mean that I couldn't understand it, right? Because certainly the balance between athletics and academics is super important to me, which is partly why I will always be in Division III, right? So I think it's really just listening for those things. So not necessarily, you might not say the exact words, but if somebody just expresses, I understand, the balance and appreciate the experience, right? I think those are the things that I can certainly listen or hear whenever folks may not be Division III, but when they say those things, like, oh, this person gets it.
Yeah, I'll talk specifically now about Miriam for the first time. So with Miriam, yeah, I don't know how many of you know this, but she was an All-American track and field athlete in Division I at Go Bearcats, Cincinnati. Give a shout out. But she also at the same time was working on her doctorate. And so there, again, to be honest, there was concern among people on the search committee of she won't get us. She won't understand what we're all about. And my response to the committee was, well, we won't know whether she can get us or not unless we ask her. And so it was framing questions to Miriam about teaching. How important was teaching, and how important to her was enhancing and nurturing the student experience. That yes, our kids are all student athletes, but at most of our schools, we expand beyond our boundaries. I gave Miriam a little guff right at the beginning because on this thing, I'm looking at it right here, and I'm like, how come I don't get Chair of Physical Education on my title? So that's critically important that we understand that we're going to interact with the entire community. We're going to interact with all students. And yes, I get it that there were some people within our search committee who were fearful that with her experience at Cincinnati probably being very different as a student athlete in Division I, could she understand and differentiate what it would be like to be working in our community?
Okay, so we're going to pivot here a little bit and talk about retention of staff. And I think a topic that probably can help us bridge from both the hiring process and the retention process is to talk a little bit about the surrounding campus community, both the campus proper and then the larger community that it's involved with, and how that impacts both hiring and retaining.
want me to take that one? Okay. Again, the community is really important, but jumping into the retention side to it now, just as one example, it was making sure, so speaking internally to our own community, it's making sure that when we have a hire, a BIPOC member, that we do everything we can to network and connect that person appropriately within their community. Broadening, Clinton is a rough place for diversity, and it's understanding that, and I'm sure Miriam will get into it more, but it's understanding that she needed, and others. So when I'm speaking directly about Miriam, she's not the only BIPOC member that we have hired, but it's understanding that any member we bring in, they'll have certain desires, and even go so far as to say needs, like she mentioned her hair, not me. But it's that understanding. It's when she's going up to watch our teams play at Bowdoin, it's like, why don't you take an extra day and stop in Boston, where you'll feel a little bit more at home maybe than you are in Clinton. So I think there's a lot of ways to think about. You have to be intentional in understanding that you have to find ways to make people feel comfortable, and that's all of us. We all need to feel comfortable in our communities, and so it's finding ways to establish that comfort.
Yeah, and when you talk about, me not being the only one, in Clinton, yes, it is cold, it is rural, but the fact that John had, my predecessor, Angel Mason, me, Dee, now, if that can happen in succession, then I think that it can happen anywhere, right? So it's really about what you need to be intentional in thinking about. One other thing I want to talk about as it relates to retention is this concept of solo status. So solo status is kind of the pressure that you feel when you are the only one in the group, right? It kind of feels like there is a flashlight on you when you speak, when you do anything. The research shows that you really need to get up to about 30% of that particular population before folks really start to feel like the spotlight is not on me. I say that to say, oftentimes you get one hire and you're like, yes, but you're not done, right? So really want to try to work towards a 30% total population of folks of color so that the spotlight on those who are in the minority is decreased. So I want to kind of take that a little bit step further as we think about retention.
Excuse me. You talk about how you're doing it in your institution and how you're growing it. Oh, sorry. Katari Key, Director of Athletics, Alverno College. Talk to me about how you influence your colleagues across your conference and in your network to maybe hire or even look at people of color. Because as a woman of color who's also an athletic director, I've managed to hire 3 African Americans in my 2 years at my institution for the first time in the school's history in my department. So I would love to know and trying constantly within my conference to say, hey, we're talking the walk, we're talking the talk, we're not walking the walk, and they're out there. We have Chicago, we have Milwaukee. So talk to me about how you influence people in your conference to do what you're doing, but also people around you so that we're not just operating in silos and dealing with a lot of purple unicorns.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think it's important, that's why it was important to have John on this panel, right? Is so that he could kind of talk from a perspective, that's different than mine. I think there are some colleagues who just don't care, won't get it. There's no headway that I'm gonna be able to make. But to be able to continue to have these conversations publicly, right, that we are having here, one-on-one with individuals is important. As well as when I see an emerging leader coming through and jobs come open, reaching out to a colleague to say, so-and-so, you should reach out to so-and-so, I've had a really great conversation, or they're over here doing this really great thing. I'll also add a plug. So the student immersion program goes on during this the convention. it is a fabulous opportunity to get to know up-and-coming student athletes and sometimes graduate students of color. So one example I'll quickly give, and then I'll let you, oh, now I'm being long-winded. But one example I will give is, so we just hired for our assistant AD for events and ops, and that young man went through the student immersion program about 4 years ago. So, right, that connection right there was a really great one that allowed us to really have a place for him later on. He came to us from Tufts, so thank you, Tufts. But yeah, so I think those are some ways. But ultimately, I think in my mind, there are some folks that the needle just will never move with them, and whenever they retire, we just hope that whoever comes in next has that mentality, a different mentality.
Yeah, thank you. Congratulations to you on your hiring as well. You asked about the how I might navigate colleagues in the conference. I would back it up actually to talk about navigating colleagues in our department. I always try to start at actions speak louder than words. And so I hope that in modeling what I'm doing, others will kind of take the hint, get the message, etc., and start to be more tuned in with their own hiring as head coaches about who they're putting onto their staffs. And so I have given a lot of latitude and autonomy to head coaches to do what I think is best and healthiest for our college community. And in some instances, more recently, we have stripped a little bit of the autonomy and pushed for results. And so my point is that sometimes just doing things and hoping people will catch on isn't always enough.
And one of the things that I'll add that we did whenever I was there is, so oftentimes when coaches could hire, they would just hire their buddy or somebody they knew that often looked like them. So we wanted to make sure that there was at least another person in the room to make sure that there was a process and that the candidate pool was diverse. So I think that's one way that you talk about kind of not necessarily stripping autonomy, but adding some layers there.
Yeah, we added layers in the process. Originally, it was complete autonomy, and a head coach could go find who they wanted, and it almost always ended up a friend, somebody they already had an established relationship with, and so we've created a much better process now, where DIII, you out there, you're very involved now in all of our assistant coach hiring.
I think we have another question.
Adam Hutchinson, Earlham College, Director of Athletics. Is it Katara? Katara? Okay. My experience aligns with Katara. I've been at Earlham for 2 years, and in our department, there's a gentleman who I work with who speaks about his time being the only in the department, and how the experiences he had and how that impacted him. And in 2 years, we had a lot of openings because of the pandemic, but a third of our department is now black or brown. So that confirmed for me something I've long believed, that I'm not a unicorn, that this gentleman who I share experiences with is not a unicorn, that there are candidates who exist, and that there were flaws in the process. We started talking about hiring. I also want to kind of touch on retention, because I hear you kind of saying general themes of, well, here's what the community might be like. I know, and most of the black folks I know when we take a job, okay, here's what it's going to be. And while things are never perfect, we're perfectly capable of navigating that. When people leave, they often leave for very specific reasons. And do you have a best practice, or could you talk about a best practice in terms of exit interviews and recording what people say, And how do you ensure that what gets recorded is what they say and not what the institution wants to hear? Because I think that institutions that have trouble retaining Black and brown people have a potential gold mine of data from the people who left. If you ask folks why they leave, they'll tell you. But can you record it? Can you ensure that what gets recorded is what they're saying?
Yeah, I want to jump in if I can. People over my tenure at Hamilton have learned on search committees to not bring up the likelihood that someone will stay. I don't care if they stay. If we only ever hire based on how long someone will stay, I would argue we're hiring the wrong people. I want people who aren't leaving because of me. I want people leaving because I have mentored them, helped them grow to a point where they want something greater, something bigger. My measurement isn't how long will someone stay. My measurement is, do they have the capacity to leave us better than we were before we brought them in? That's my measurement. And I know that doesn't align with all of you and your measurement, but that's mine. I am fine when people commit to learning, to coming and getting their hands around this job. I can tell you in almost every instance, they learn that it's much bigger than what they think it was going to be coming in. And that's where mentoring is so critical. It is finding that space where you can delegate and allow people to grow as leaders, but offer them your office and your counsel as a safe space. There has to be a safe space to make mistakes. I always tell them, if you don't know what to do, don't say I don't know what to do. Just say, let me think about it and get back to you. And then come in my office, close the door, and say, here's what I've got. My first pushback is always going to be, well, what do you got? Well, how do you want to handle that? How do you want to take it? And then I'm going to work from that vantage point. But it's fine. You can't just take someone. Earlier I talked about not just being set on experience. If you acknowledge that you're not just setting on experience, I'll tell you as an older white person, hiring administrators in the BIPOC community, it's work. It's work on the front end to establish networks and to seek them out as candidates. It's work while they're there. It's work for anybody, any administrator, not just BIPOC members. But the people that I have had have grown, and it's finding, and Miriam can speak to it probably better than I, but I think I hone in a lot on making sure my office is an incredibly safe location to grow, but yet slowly reel out the line and give them more and more leadership and autonomy.
Yeah, and Adam, to your question, one of the things that I think about, so exit interviews happen on our campus through HR and not necessarily through me, but what kind of institutionally, right, if folks of color are exiting, folks on campus know why, right? So do we need or should we wait for an exit interview for that to be the time that the institution does something about it? So perhaps it's conversations with your direct report about how things can be better, right? But what I have also recognized is that being in a position of power in my department, I don't want that to be the experience of people who are in my department, right? And that's certainly what I can control. So hopefully departmentally that's helpful, but institutionally, right, can I use my voice for this person who exited or folks who are exiting, because we all kind of know why people are exiting, if that's helpful.
believe we had another question.
Yeah, Tom Galbraith, Director of Athletics at Randolph College. And this is a space that Randolph struggles. I've been at Randolph just over a year, so I'm kind of learning my own space right now. But this is an area that Randolph struggles, not just in athletics, but as an entire institution. And so, as fate would have it, earlier this week, I'm actually determined to try and make that different. But in a conversation, or actually a meeting to talk about this very topic with my DEI person on campus, we started talking about intentionality and language, and I think John spoke to it a little bit in even just the posting of your job opening and stuff like that. But the irony that I found in that meeting was, we use terms like minority candidate, and in describing myself in that meeting, I used ally and advocate, and my DEI person didn't like that word, or didn't like really any of those words. And so we started talking very intentionally about intentionality and about language. And again, I was surprised because I've always viewed myself as an ally and an advocate, and yet the person who I'm trying to partner with to come up with a plan is telling me that's not something that she would use. And so we struggled even to find another word, but I mean, her argument back to me was that sets a tone of outsider. If you're an ally or an advocate, you're on the outside kind of looking in, and you want to be inside looking out, maybe. I don't know. But I'm just wondering about your experience about language and intentionality, and how those things play into coming up and devising a plan at a place that really has struggled in this area.
Yeah, I do think language is important. The challenge, or sometimes with language, is that it's ever changing, right? So just making sure that you are up on what is still okay, what is not, what terms you should be using. So, and when you use a term that is no longer being used and somebody educates you on it, being okay with that, like, got it, and making the change. There's something else I was going to add to. I'll think about it in a second. You got something there?
I don't.
If I do, I'll jump back in.
So we have about 15 minutes remaining, and I want either of our panelists to speak here to, everything we're doing is in the service of the athlete experience, and so how this topic touches on the athlete experience and our students, and either increased hiring, or if people are in fact leaving institutions, coaches, administrators of color, how that impacts your student experience.
Yeah, I'll jump in and give a very specific example. Like a lot of us, our institutions run campus climate surveys periodically, and we had done during Miriam's tenure at our school, there had been a campus climate survey, and a lot of I don't remember specifically, Miriam would probably remember it better than I, but she came to see me, we met. That's another thing, I'll digress here for a second. Make sure your door is open all the time. It's tough to live on a calculated schedule with people because real life doesn't happen in that easy and categorized way. So having a door that's open and welcoming is really critical. But Miriam stopped in and said, have you read the campus climate survey results? And I said, no, I hadn't yet. And she pointed out an area that she wanted me to pay close attention to. And then she said, and after you've read it, let me know, and I'd like to circle back and have a discussion. So I read the campus climate survey, and what jumped out was the lack of sense of belonging of our BIPOC community in our greater community. And that was my takeaway, and I knew that's the part she wanted me to digest. And when we met, she said, are you supportive of me working with IT, our research area, and doing a kind of a climate survey of our student athletes? Because I'd like to know, I think we should know if they feel that same lack of belonging, and certainly correct me if I'm off on some of this, but her idea was that we need to assess the level of belonging that our BIPOC student athletes have or don't have. And I thought it was a great idea. It's not one that I had thought of. And she took it from there and learned a great deal about how our student athletes feel about the campus community in general versus what they felt on their teams. And I think our greatest takeaway, and she did programming specifically around the results that we were able to garner by drilling down further. And what we realized was that our BIPOC community had a real sense of belonging among other members of the BIPOC community on their teams, but that we really didn't have much intentional or unintentional programming that would connect members of that community across our entire athletic department. And so there's a very specific example. Turn it.
And now I remember my second piece, so I'm going to go ahead and go there. So I wanted to talk about, because I think language is important, but I think it's also, let's take a look at why folks of color don't apply. So I had done my dissertation on self-limiting behavior, which is why people decide to kind of limit themselves. Certainly it was specifically with Black women, but what we found is two things. One is they will self-limit because just women in general say, I don't have all of these things, so therefore I can't apply. And then in particular, Black women actually felt that they would go to the website and say, it's not diverse enough, it's probably not a place for me. So if that is an institution that you are at, what I might suggest you might do is do the front end work, and I'll give a quick example. So we will be hiring for a head men's track and field and cross country coach. So I went to my dean of faculty, who I directly report to, and said, diversity is super important. I want to make sure that this search or the candidate pool is very robust. And so I would like to go to the track and field convention and be able to talk to folks about the position. Okay, so I got some money, and I went on over to Denver, right, and really spent about 36 hours and met with 15 people, most of which were folks of color or women. Also met with some men as well, and some white men. But what I want to say is being able to do that, talked about my institution, kind of what we stand for, and it was less about me interviewing people, but just talking about what I have to offer. So if we flip that, if I was white identified and I had those meetings with people, and folks of color now have an understanding of who I am as a white identified person, and even though the website is all white, I now feel as if I have a connection to this person, and this could be a place where I could belong.
Did you want to speak to the second question on student athlete experience, or are we good?
I think John took it.
Okay. So as we start to wind down here a little bit, I think both of these topics really speak to the creating an underlying culture, right, of diversity and inclusion, and both how that affects our staffing and our athletes. So as we start to wrap up here, is there any additional comments or thoughts that you have on creating that culture and how that fosters the hiring and the retention?
So I just want to talk about kind of salary negotiations really quickly, because I think that's helpful, right? So one of the things I want to bring up is Tusi and colleagues in 2019 did a study about compared white men and women and then folks of color as it relates to negotiation, and found that not only gender limits, the negotiation, or they're impacted by negotiations, but folks of color are, right? So I say that to say that oftentimes when negotiations happen, either women or folks of color aren't doing it, or they just aren't negotiating in a way that their white colleagues are. So as someone, oftentimes we have flexibility on what we can offer, so we have a window. I just want to add that it is a conscious choice to start at the lowest amount, and that's for anybody, right? So if and when, and if you decide that you want to maybe start $1,000 higher or two, certainly that is an option that we have, but I want to bring that to the front of your mind, that when we have the power to start the negotiations, right? And if you have a window, it will be a conscious choice on your effort as to where you start that negotiation. So I just wanted to add that.
John, anything you'd like to add?
I think I'm good, unless people have a question.
Yeah, we're happy to entertain some more questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir.
Hi, Steve Murray, Associate AD at McAllister College. Excuse me. Could you explain or share with us what the student, and this is more probably for assistant head coach hiring, what your student athlete involvement is in the hiring process and what the conversations or education you provide them as they are part of that?
I'll let John go because I pretty much mirror his process.
Yeah, I'll be honest, our student athletes, you bring up a great point, because our student athletes have not been very involved in our hiring of assistant coaches. Now it'll give me one more thing to wander away from here thinking about. I'll talk about it, the involvement of student athletes from my perspective. We didn't involve them at all during my time in Division I at Butler. Hamilton, it's been different. We do involve the students. And I'm interested, again, not, digress again, a couple stories. I've often found, when student athletes wanted were happy a coach was gone, and would say, we really need to move on from that coach. There's usually a reason. I get it that every coach isn't perfect, and I still think there's more bad fits than there are bad coaches. But I also think that the student athlete who wants to move on usually is the kid who needs that coach to move on. I don't usually have captains in my office saying, boy, I hope so-and-so's out of here. That's not how it usually plays. I think it's important to have the student athletes in there as a filter to, again, based on fit and character, more so than my concern on whether the student athlete, I don't know how much the student athlete knows about the best qualities that I'm looking for in a coach all the time. So I do use student athletes, but I tell them that they're not a yes vote, but they certainly are a no vote. So if anyone is not a good fit for their team or for our college, that's their process of weeding out.
And I think to add to that, so when our student athletes will definitely meet with head coach candidates. But one of the things I also ask them to do is to send just pros, cons, and not ranking, right? So that just helps me if I choose somebody and you're like, I told you I wanted, right? I'm not asking for that. So making sure that it's just pros, cons, but same thing, they'll have their time with the coach, but now thinking about assistant coaches.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, and I win that. Holly Repke, Director of Athletics, Cal Lutheran. So we talked about hiring, retaining coaches of color. Can we speak about intersectional identities, how we support those identities? We've started to dive into women, women of color. And so what does that look like, especially those that have conflicting expectations in terms of time, et cetera?
Thank you so much for asking that question. And I want to talk about it with my experience at Hamilton, but I'll dig into the identity of woman, mother, family, right? So one of the things that was super important, okay, let me also talk about some research. So what we also know is about year 5, women who have families decide to exit out of athletics because that's the time when they're either deciding about family or it's becoming too much. So really trying to make sure that we are creating a space where these two things can mesh is important. So one of the things that I'll talk about, and I'm going to tell a story for you, So we had two female head coaches who had just had babies. And one of the things is one of them was breastfeeding. So whenever it was time for her season to come around, John gave the okay, which was going to be an additional financial expense for her to travel with a caregiver so that she could continue to breastfeed, as well as we had to get a bigger bus so that car seat could fit into it. Additional funds to the budget, right? But it is important, right? He was willing to make that decision and say yes, because it is more important that your two identities can coexist than it is for me to say, that's not our policy. If folks have kids around, love it, right? Making sure that as long as folks can get their work done, this is a place where students can be, or kids can be. What I realize is that may be different on your campus, but that is something that I am very intentional about. So certainly as it applies to the women and families. One other thing I want to talk about too, I've gotten on a soapbox now, is just about the grind of athletics, and that certainly falls heavy on women and those who have families. I am really starting to think about now how we undo this grind, because I'm not sure that a lot of us will be able to grind for the 30 plus years that a lot of our predecessors were doing it. So if you all are interested, there's a book called Rest is Resistance that has started me on a tangent. But one of the things that I want to think about, and I hope you all can help me think about collectively, because this helps us all, is how we certainly support our students, but it is not 80, 90 hours a week for the whole academic year. Soapbox done, thanks.
Yeah, but a very important one. So I'm going to jump on that soapbox and add a little bit more. I think it's absolutely critical. How many of us are struggling to find athletic trainers? Yeah, exactly. I'm in that parade. Life balance is going out the window, and we really have to work hard to try to maintain it, or we won't have any women who have children in our profession anymore. There has to, I'm in a constant pushback with some people in our department who feel like I'm giving too much leniency to those who have just had children, who have just given birth, and I just, I know I'm painting broad brushed, and usually we get in trouble when we paint broad brush, but I'll do it anyway. The amount of time and energy that my wife put into raising our two children is not comparable to the time I put in. I don't think I was a bad father. I think they would both tell you I've been a wonderful father, but I'm realistic about the amount of time and nurturing that Carol spent with our two daughters. And we have several children right now in our department, and those coaches have stayed, and I think that's critically important that they have continued to coach through raising their families. And so, as Miriam said, we find ways. I think it's really important to find ways to not cave and bend over and let them run roughshod, but to understand that they love their profession, they want to keep doing what they're doing, but they need a little bit of leniency and a little guidance. I mean, for crying out loud, does it really matter if they cover 3 more events out of season for you? Figure it out. There's plenty of other people who have time that can do that. And so, again, it all comes back to building community where there's a greater understanding beyond me of everyone working in our department that this is a collective, that this isn't a one-person dictatorship calling out every order, that we need everybody to step up and facilitate and enhance our program whenever necessary or possible.
I think that's a nice note to end on, and I've been taking notes up here while both of you have been talking, so I picked up some thanks today too. So please join me in thanking John and Miriam.
Thank you, everyone.
Just a few housekeeping things for everybody. You can use the hashtag NCAA CONV and follow at Inside the NCAA on Twitter for updates on the convention. And you are encouraged to please complete the brief session survey located on the NCAA convention app. And as a reminder, the Woman of the Year Awards Luncheon ticket holders, that event begins at 11:30 in the Stars at Night Ballroom on the 3rd floor of the Convention Center, and a standby line will also be available. Thank you very much.